Spencer, I want to start with those two headlines, and you specialize in looking at satellite imagery, understanding the extent of damage from attacks and what's actually happening at these facilities. I know it's still early days, early hours at this point, but what can you tell us about the yellow cake production plant in Yazd province and the Kondub heavy water research reactor that was targeted twice, at least according to semi-official news agencies?
Yeah, well, first off, thank you for having me on the show. Really appreciate it. So the Kondub research reactor, it's also known as the Arak IR-40 reactor. It was a reactor that was built many years ago, possibly for the intention of producing plutonium. And plutonium is one of the key resources that are used in producing different types of nuclear weapons. For example, during the June 2025 war, it was targeted. The dome of the building was penetrated and likely the reactor was destroyed. It wasn't operating at the time, so there's no release of radiation, et cetera. Israel at the time also attacked the heavy water plant. They damaged one of the last stages in the heavy water production. Heavy water is a very important chemical compound that is necessary to operate heavy water reactors. It's also a source of neutrons in a nuclear weapon. So destroying this facility is incredibly important to creating bottlenecks in Iran's future ability to create nuclear weapons. What we saw at Articon is also similar. Articon was used to convert natural uranium into yellow cake. And yellow cake is what's converted into uranium hexafluoride, which is ultimately enriched to higher and higher levels and possibly weapon grade levels. So we're seeing Israel eliminate certain stages and steps and that are vital for Iran to be able to continue its enrichment program and wider nuclear program.
Are there any key red lines the international community is watching when it comes to this?
Necessarily, it would be the enrichment up to 90%. That has been stated to be a massive red line that if Iran touches that, in the past, obviously, many past presidents have stated that that would trigger strikes. But the key here is that Iran hasn't reached that yet. But what Iran has been doing, they've been accumulating very large quantities of 60% highly enriched uranium over the last several years. They're the only country in the world that does that doesn't have a nuclear weapon. There's no civilian application for that type of enrichment. So there's no justification whatsoever.
Spencer, can the U.S. and Israel destroy Iran's nuclear facilities without endangering bystanders through the release of radioactive material?
Yeah, certainly. You wouldn't want to target something like a Bushehr-style nuclear reactor. That would have very large consequences. You wouldn't want to hit the actual reactor itself. But the other facilities, such as Fordow, Natanz, Esfahan, et cetera, those are relatively isolated facilities. They're a good distance away from populations, and the actual risk of dispersion on a wide level is relatively low. It would be very isolated to the facilities themselves.
Do the attacks in recent days on these facilities, do they call into question the official U.S. assessment or of the damage assessment of the June 2025 strikes? Because I think a lot of folks thought, okay, well, based on the rhetoric and what we heard from the president at the time, the nuclear program in Iran was set back quite a bit.
Yeah. So, we had some issues with that initial assessment. I think you're referring to the assessment that said it was only set back a few months. We had some issues with that. Our analysis stated that the program was severely set back. The June 2025 war effectively destroyed Iranian's enrichment program, and enrichment is a bottleneck in the ability to produce a nuclear weapon. If you cannot get to 90% weapon grade material, it's very hard to build any sort of usable nuclear weapon. 60% highly enriched uranium, technically, theoretically, can be used to build a nuclear weapon, but it's not practical. It's very hard to deliver. It'd be a very large device. But what Iran had plans to do during its Ahmad plan, and that was ended in 2003 explicitly and continued in a more covert form, was to build missile deliverable miniaturized warheads that would fit on a Shahab 3 ballistic missile. And so that's a very different thing. Our assessment was that their program was severely set back and it would take years for Iran to recover what they actually lost. But that doesn't mean that Iran doesn't have options. So after the war, there's a few outstanding elements that were left over. For example, obviously, everyone's talking about the highly enriched uranium. Half of it, the 220 kilograms of the 60%, is likely in the tunnel complex at Isfahan. There's a lot of talk and chatter about that right now. Iran also produced a number of advanced centrifuges that they built but likely never deployed. So there's questions about where is that, and then the wider state of what's the actual accounting of all this. The IAEA has not been allowed to conduct inspections on the ground. So there's significant questions here, and it leaves Iran options for the future.